Air India v Nargesh Meerza, AIR 1981 SC 1829. Parties: Plaintiff, Air India. Defendant, Nargesh Meerza and other air hostesses. Facts: the case of Air India v Nargesh Meerza dealt with the service conditions and employment regulations of air hostesses in Air India, which were challenged as being discriminatory and unconstitutional. Nargesh Meerza, an air hostess employed by Air India, along with other air hostesses, filed a writ petition challenging certain provisions of Air India's service regulations on the grounds that they were arbitrary, unreasonable, and violated fundamental rights. The challenged regulations stipulated that air hostesses would be terminated from service upon the occurrence of certain events, such as reaching the age of 35, marriage within the first 4 years of service, and pregnancy. The air hostesses argued that these provisions were discriminatory based on gender and amounted to a violation of Articles 14, 15, and 16 of the Indian Constitution. They claimed that these regulations restricted their personal choices related to marriage and motherhood and violated their right to equality. Furthermore, they argued that male employees in similar roles, such as flight pursers, did not face the same restrictions, making the rules arbitrary and discriminatory. On the other hand, Air India defended its regulations, asserting that they were necessary to maintain the efficiency of services and the overall image of the airline. The company argued that the early retirement age and restrictions related to marriage and pregnancy were in line with the specific requirements of the air hostess role. Issues before the court: 1. Whether the service regulations of Air India, which required air hostesses to retire upon reaching the age of 35, upon pregnancy, or upon marriage within the first 4 years of service, violated Articles 14, 15, and 16 of the Indian Constitution. 2. Whether these regulations constituted gender discrimination and arbitrary classification based on sex. 3. Whether the service rules were reasonable and justified in light of the nature of the job as an air hostess. Decision of the court: the Supreme Court of India delivered a significant ruling in favor of the air hostesses, declaring that the contested regulations of Air India were unconstitutional. The court held that the provisions in Air India's service rules, which mandated termination upon marriage within the first 4 years of service or pregnancy, were discriminatory and violated the air hostesses' fundamental rights under Articles 14, right to equality, and 16, equality of opportunity in employment. Marriage restriction: the court found that the restriction on marriage within the first 4 years of service was unreasonable and arbitrary. It observed that a woman's right to marry and choose her personal life cannot be curtailed by such employment conditions. The rule was not based on any rational classification and hence violated Article 14, as it did not apply to male employees performing similar duties. The court ruled that the regulation was a clear example of gender-based discrimination, prohibited under Article 15. Pregnancy restriction: the court was particularly critical of the regulation that forced air hostesses to retire upon becoming pregnant. It described the rule as the most callous and cruel act against female employees and a violation of their fundamental right to personal liberty. The court held that pregnancy was a natural consequence of marriage and that penalizing women for becoming pregnant was irrational and discriminatory. The regulation was struck down as violative of Articles 14, 15, and 16 of the Constitution. Retirement age of 35: while the court struck down the provisions related to marriage and pregnancy, it upheld the rule that required air hostesses to retire at the age of 35. The court reasoned that the retirement age was based on the nature of the job and could be justified as a reasonable classification. However, it emphasized that early retirement should be accompanied by adequate compensation or benefits to ensure that the employees were not left without financial security. The court directed Air India to remove the discriminatory provisions and allow air hostesses to continue in service without being penalized for getting married or becoming pregnant. The judgment was a major victory for women's rights in the workplace and set a precedent for challenging discriminatory employment practices. Case analysis. The Air India v Nargesh Meerza case is a landmark judgment that addressed gender discrimination in employment and established important principles related to equality and the rights of women in the workplace. The Supreme Court's decision in this case was a significant step toward eliminating discriminatory practices in employment, particularly in industries where women were subjected to arbitrary rules based on gender stereotypes. The court's judgment reaffirmed that conditions of employment must adhere to the principles of equality enshrined in the Constitution. The case highlighted the following key legal and social issues. Gender-based discrimination. The Supreme Court's ruling was a clear statement against gender discrimination in the workplace. The regulations imposed by Air India were based on outdated notions of gender roles and unfairly penalized women for exercising their personal rights, such as the right to marry and have children. By striking down these provisions, the court reinforced the constitutional guarantee of equality and non-discrimination based on sex. Right to personal choices. The court's recognition of the right to personal choices, such as marriage and motherhood, as fundamental rights was a progressive development in Indian constitutional law. The ruling emphasized that employment conditions cannot infringe upon an individual's right to lead a normal personal life. This was a significant affirmation of the right to personal liberty under Article 21, ensuring that women are not forced to choose between their careers and their personal lives. Balancing efficiency with rights. While the court upheld the rule regarding the retirement age of 35 for air hostesses, it did so on the grounds that the nature of the job may require certain physical and aesthetic standards. However, this aspect of the ruling has been subject to debate, as it perpetuated the idea that certain jobs, particularly those involving public interaction, may impose stricter age-based requirements on women. Nonetheless, the court's emphasis on adequate compensation for early retirement indicated a concern for balancing the interests of the employer with the rights of employees. Implications for employment law. The case had far-reaching implications for employment law in India. It set a precedent for challenging discriminatory practices in various industries, particularly in cases where gender-specific regulations unfairly penalized women. The judgment also laid the groundwork for future litigation on issues related to workplace discrimination, maternity benefits, and equal treatment for women in all sectors of employment. Importance. The Air India v Nargesh Meerza case is significant for several reasons. Victory for women's rights. The case marked a major victory for women's rights in India, particularly in the workplace. The judgment struck down discriminatory service regulations that imposed unreasonable restrictions on women, ensuring that female employees were treated equally and fairly. Expansion of Article 14 and 15. The judgment expanded the scope of Articles 14 and 15 by applying them to workplace conditions. The court's decision reinforced the principle that gender-based discrimination, whether in public or private employment, is unconstitutional. Impact on employment regulations. The case prompted a re-evaluation of employment policies in various industries, particularly those with gender-based regulations. It signaled to employers that discriminatory practices could not be justified on the grounds of efficiency or public image and that all employment rules must adhere to constitutional standards of equality and fairness. Protection of personal liberty. The court's ruling emphasized the protection of personal liberty, particularly with respect to women's right to make choices about marriage and motherhood without fear of losing their jobs. This was an important affirmation of personal freedoms in the context of employment law. Legacy. The case remains a landmark judgment in Indian constitutional and employment law. It has been cited in numerous cases concerning gender discrimination and continues to serve as an important precedent in ensuring equality and fairness in the workplace. In conclusion, Air India v Nargesh Meerza played a crucial role in advancing women's rights in India. By striking down discriminatory service regulations, the judgment reinforced the principles of equality, non-discrimination, and personal liberty, making it a cornerstone in the development of employment law in the country.